Hi, today's session will be about the data sufficiency type of question that appears in the data insights section of the GMAT focus edition. As usual, we are going to talk about how do this question look like, what type of strategies that we need to keep in mind while solving these questions, and then we will try to solve one question which will demonstrate how I can get these answers faster and better. Now, before we actually go into understanding that what are these type of questions and how do they look like, a very important message that you need to understand. Please understand that data sufficiency is not really a theory but a process. You will understand it when I show you the question, but let me put it this way, that the underlying theory behind solving these questions actually lie in quantitative reasoning, verbal reasoning, or logical reasoning. Only the process is what comes in the data sufficiency questions in the data insights section. And therefore, when you actually prepare for GMAT, make sure that you practice data sufficiency while studying for quantitative reasoning or verbal reasoning or logical reasoning. Data sufficiency is not something which should be limited to preparing in the data insights section, because the underlying concepts that is required to solve these questions actually come from quant or verbal. Another important thing, most of the time the questions are easy and straightforward, but there can be some questions which are quite tricky. Mind it, I am using the word tricky and not tough. The reason is that while you might be very good with concepts or you might be very good with the process, sometimes a thin line difference between prime number, only prime number, natural number, whole number, or a very slight difference in terms of understanding the statement will create a huge difference in these questions. And therefore, for doing good in data sufficiency, it is very, very important that not only your concepts are clear, but you also have ample quantity of practice. Okay, this perhaps is one area which requires the highest amount of practice. Now, what is the good news? The good news is the more you practice, not only your efficiency for data sufficiency increases, your conceptual understanding of quant as well as VR and LR also increases. So therefore, I strongly recommend that while studying for quant or studying for VR, you side by side practice data sufficiency questions and don't wait for data insights preparation for data sufficiency preparation. For example, when you are actually studying for arithmetic or algebra in quantitative reasoning or critical reasoning in verbal reasoning, that time itself you should be able to do some data sufficiency questions based on the concepts that you just learned. Okay, so therefore, while it comes as a part of data insights section, the underlying concepts, the understanding of the question actually comes from quantitative reasoning as well as verbal reasoning. Let's look at how do this question look like. Now, this is a typical data sufficiency question. As you can see that there is one question followed by two statements, and these statements are known as data. So basically the way it looks like is that this question seeks an answer and the data to get answer to this question is available somewhere around these two statements. Now, theoretically speaking, you are not really supposed to find an answer to this question. You are only supposed to evaluate whether the two statements or the data that has been given in the question is sufficient to answer the question or not. And therefore, most of the time, you can actually save 20 to 30 seconds by not solving the question, but by just understanding whether the question can be solved and a unique answer can be found out. Mind it. Now, this is very, very important. We are now not talking about finding an answer to the question. We are talking about finding an unique answer to the question. That means when I ask you what's the value of the two-digit integer x, it is very important that if the data is sufficient to answer the question, it should be sufficient to give me one unique value of x. If there are multiple answers that x can take, then we actually are saying that the data is not sufficient to get an answer. The instructions are pretty standard. They have never changed over the last 20 years. It still says you mark A if statement 1 alone is sufficient to answer the question, 2 is not. B if statement 2 alone is sufficient to answer the question, 1 is not. C if both these statements together are sufficient but neither statement alone is sufficient. D if each statement alone is sufficient to answer the question. And E if statement 1 and 2 together only 1 and 2 together are not sufficient to answer the question. Now, it is very important that when you do this question, you need to understand the algorithm which follows. Let's look at the algorithm first. Now, keeping the instruction sidewise, when you start evaluating, you might need to understand that we start by checking statement 1. Is statement 1 sufficient to answer the question? If yes, you move to checking statement 2 and see if it is sufficient to answer the question. If I go with both the yeses, that means statement 1 as well as statement 2 is sufficient to answer the question, which means that automatically we say that each statement alone is sufficient to answer the question. So the choice is D. Now, wait. The clue out here or the caution out here that you need to keep in mind is when you check statement 1, you don't look at statement 2. Similarly, when you look at statement 2, you do not keep the hangover of statement 1. Both these statements needs to be checked independently first. Where do I merge them? Where do I see them together? Let's watch out. Let's see what happens if statement 1 is not sufficient to answer the question. If statement 1 is not sufficient to answer the question, we start checking statement 2. If statement 2 is sufficient to answer the question, mind it, without taking the help of statement 1. That means we have a situation wherein statement 2 is sufficient to answer the question, 1 is not. And that is where we can say that the choice will be option B. That means statement 2 alone is sufficient to answer the question, but statement 1 alone is not sufficient to answer the question. Now the unique thing happens when 1 alone is not sufficient as well as 2 alone is not sufficient to answer the question. That is the only time wherein we actually combine the two statements or see these two statements together. Now, in this also, as you can see, two situations can happen. If statement 1 and 2 together is sufficient to answer the question, that means if we are saying, if we are saying statement 1 and 2 together is sufficient to answer the question, that means we see both these statements together and we say that statement 1 as well as statement 2 together is sufficient, but neither statement alone is sufficient to answer the question. So we go with choice C. However, if even after combining, so independently they failed, but even after combining, if they together did not suffice to get an answer or a unique answer to this question, we will say both these statements together are not sufficient to answer the question and therefore the answer is E. Okay. Now this is very, very important that you understand the process completely and make sure that the first check is with statement 1 and statement 2 independent of each other. And only when statement 1 fails to give a unique answer, statement 2 independently fails to give a unique answer, only then we combine. If statement 1 alone is sufficient, 2 is not, we know that A is the answer. If statement 2 alone is sufficient, 1 is not, we know that B is the answer. If statement 1 alone was sufficient, statement 2 alone was sufficient, then option D is the answer. And if A, B or D, any one of them is possible, then we do not combine the two statements under any circumstances. Combining the two statements will come if and only if statement 1 independently has failed to get an answer, statement 2 independently has also failed to get an answer. Otherwise, we never combine the two statements. Okay. Now, this is the tricky part and that is where you need to keep in mind. Okay. Let's try to see if we can solve this question. Okay. Now, in this question, as you can see, they're asking for what's the value of the two-digit number x. And we have been given two data, that is sum of the digits is 5 and x is divisible by 5. Now, if you know the concepts, the first step, and please remember, you need to be religious about it, is that you look at the statements independently. So let's look at the first statement. It says the sum of the two digits is 5. Now, please remember, I do not look at the second statement at all. Let's play with the numbers. It is a two-digited number and the sum of the two digits is 5. So what are the possible numbers? Let's look at it. It can be 1, 4. It can be 2, 3. Okay. It can be 4, 1. And it can be 3, 2. Okay. All of them are two-digited numbers. Okay. Now we cannot take 5, 0. We can keep 5, 0, but then please make sure that we keep that in mind, that we are talking about the two digit sum being 5. So therefore 5, 0 is also possible, but 0, 5 is not possible. You can see that we have reversed the numbers of 1, 4 and 4, 1, 2, 3 and 3, 2. But for 5, 0, the reverse number is 0, 5, which is not a two-digited number. Now, obviously, therefore, going by the first statement, we have got 5 possible values of x, and therefore we can safely say statement 1 is not sufficient to answer the question. Now, don't give an hangover of statement 1. Let's look at statement 2. Now, if you look at statement 2 without keeping any hangover of statement 1, please remember there is absolutely nothing that you remember of statement 1. Statement 2 says x is divisible by 5. Now, you know that once x is divisible by 5, that means the number should be ending with 0 or 5, and therefore if we start looking at the two-digit numbers, any number which is divisible by 5, whether it is 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35 and so on, okay, up till 95, all these numbers can be possible value of x, and therefore statement 2 alone also has failed to give you an unique answer for the value of x. Now, if you remember, that is where we try to see both these statements together, not before that. Okay. The statement 1 had independently failed to give an answer. It gave me 5 possible values of x. Statement 2 obviously gave me a lot more possible values of x, and we did not reach to one unique solution. Okay. Now, if I combine the two statements, now what does the combining of the two statements mean? Combining the two statements means that we now assume both the statements to be simultaneously together true. Till now we were not saying that. Till now we were saying a statement 1 true, we check the possibilities, forget about it. Statement 2, we take it as truth, check the possibilities, forget about it. And we don't take care of statement 1 together. One statement 1 and statement 2 have individually failed to give an unique answer. We take both these statements together. Now, when we take both these statements together, that means the sum of the two digits should be equal to 5 and x is also divisible by 5. And now here the clear cut thing is and. That means both these statements are to be true simultaneously. Then you will see for yourself that these 4 options from statement 1 quickly vanishes because none of them are divisible by 5. Now there is only one number which satisfies both the conditions, that the sum of the two digits is 5 and is also x is divisible by 5, that is 50. That means combining the two statements you get the answer, and therefore my answer is option C. I hope this is clear. Is the process understood? Okay. Now, before we end this session and telling you about all the concepts, just remember one thing. Unless and until you don't know the divisibility rule of 5, unless and until you don't know how to calculate sum of the digits of a two-digit number, etc., you will not be able to solve this question. And while actually learning the properties of numbers, you should be actually doing certain number of data sufficiency questions as a practice, so that the concept as well as the process fits in your mind then and there. Do not wait for the data insight section to start to practice your data sufficiency questions. 2 key things. 1, please learn your concepts while doing quantitative reasoning and verbal reasoning. Second, concentrate on the process. And third but last thing, ample amount of practice, because as I said, the trickiness lies in the detail of the question. Okay, and a ideal time to do these questions is anywhere between 1 to 1.5 minutes. The reason is very simple. You don't have to really go through the instructions much. They are standard instructions, so you don't have to read through them. You know that the instructions will be same. Second, the questions by length will not be very high. So the only time that you require is just to evaluate the two statements and figure out whether you can get the answer to the question or not. I hope this video gave you a good clarity about how to solve the data sufficiency questions. Remember, in the data insight section, we expect that a good student will get at least 2 to 3 data sufficiency questions, and they can actually improve your marks significantly. Thanks for watching.